Welcome back, everyone. This is Austin Reville with 2FC Tactical on our From the Vault series, featuring unique and historical firearms that come through our shop. Got another one here for you today. So yes, I'm going to do another shameless plug real quick. Smith & Wesson, we'd love to have you sponsor the channel. I'm just going to do that since I have the flag in the back. They're not going to, just so you know. And that's really just a shameless plug for no reason. We're going to have some fun on this channel, and we want to make sure it's not too dry all the time. So, of course, we're going to do shameless plugs to lighten up the mood. But we do have a very cool piece of history for you here today. Now, this is a semi-auto variant, modern production Ohio Ordnance copy of the BAR, or Browning Automatic Rifle 1918. This particular one is a A3, is what we would call an A3 variant, or really an A2, just a semi-auto version of it. But the Browning Automatic Rifle is a really, really cool gun that has its roots in World War I, but really wouldn't come to fruition, and we wouldn't really see its use until World War II, or at least widespread use. So let's talk a little bit about this. So this was actually originally designed in 1910 by the famed John Moses Browning. Who else? The man who shaped the modern world in more ways than one, really, when you think about it. He designed this all up as the Browning machine rifle, I believe is what it's called, the BMR, and couldn't find any buyers for it. It's 1910. War had not kicked off in Europe. The United States has no real military doctrine, especially when it comes to weapons procurement, and didn't see any need for this. It is chambered in .30-06, the round of the time, and this was done deliberately to make it useful and easy to implement with the round already in service with the U.S. military, obviously with the 1903 Springfield rifles. So this was a gun well ahead of its time in 1910. You could make the argument it was a gun well behind its time by the time World War II breaks out. But with that being said, it did serve admirably in U.S. forces. Now, when it comes to World War I, by the time it kicks off in 1914, the United States is really struggling to come up with guns for this conflict. Of course, we wouldn't enter the conflict until 1916, 2 years after hostilities had started. We were using mostly foreign-produced machine guns. The Vickers guns, the Chauchat from the French, so on and so forth. So we didn't have a large domestic production of machine guns, especially for the U.S. military. One of the reasons for this was just because, A, we didn't have any doctrine of their implementation, and B, truthfully, we were still operating under very fiscally conservative principles, especially when it came to military rifles. We saw that with the Krag rifle that we showed you several videos ago, where the single cartridge loading side gate was done to slow down rates of fire intentionally to make it cheaper to operate. That is the idea. While that is certainly admirable, sometimes in warfare that is to the detriment of the shooter, if you will, or of your infantrymen. And we would certainly see in World War I where old world principles of tactics came head to head with modern automatic weaponry. The ideas of charging fixed positions in open fields with bayonets attached and bolt action rifles. We would see dug in trench warfare, of course, with mustard gas and all the horrors of World War I. We would also see horse cavalry literally transition in front of our eyes in World War I to tank warfare that would really come into full fruition in World War II, with Rommel and Patton being the forefront of using tanks in a traditional horse cavalry role, and just using these armored horses is the way they kind of started moving those pieces around, whereas the French were just using them as mostly battering rams to run over trenches and infantry come behind it. So we're seeing tactics just drastically change over the course of World War I. And that's kind of where this comes into play. And I do want to mention, this is one of the coolest things about this gun, I should say, is that John Moses Browning personally took two machine guns, and this being one of them, up to Washington, D.C., basically just knocked on the doors. This is 1917, excuse me. So he's just walking around with machine guns here. It's like, I got this gun that I think would be useful in the conflict over in Europe. Let me demonstrate them for you. They just go out and demonstrate them to about 300 people, and they're like, you know what? Actually, both of those look good. Let's buy the contracts for both of them. And they would go into production. These would be very rushed. So this would eventually be renamed to the BAR 1918. Colt and a few others would make this particular gun under patent for Browning. The A1 variants, or the M1918 variants, did feature a little bit longer barrel. Obviously, there would be a bipod on this coming World War II, but those did not have bipods. So this is more in line of what that would look like. The idea behind the implementation of these guns was you would walk in line, side by side, with several people with these, and hip fire at your enemy trench, basically to keep the heads down, while your main infantry would advance behind you and eventually swarm into the trench. Something that the Thompson 1921, the idea was they would be the ones going into the trench and clearing out trenches. This would be more of the sweeping, walking, hip fire way of life, if you will, for the implementation of this gun. Now, there is some drawbacks to it. It has a 20-round magazine, which does kind of limit your ability to do this, though that tactic would be used in the Pacific by the Marine Corps with these guns. So it did make an appearance the way it was intended to be implemented. And we're going to get to the World War II here in a minute. But in 1918, when these were really rushed into production, by, I think it was June, they went into production it was April, and by June they were delivering guns. Now, the first 9,000 guns were out of spec. They rushed them so much they found out parts didn't fit all the guns. They only fit certain guns. So they shut down production, reworked the machines and production values to make sure the guns came into spec. They did see very limited service. In fact, Val Browning, John Moses Browning's son, would actually use one of these in World War I to great success. With that being said, they were mostly held back. Some of it's just because of the limited numbers. Roughly, I think it's 54,000 of these guns would see the field before the armistice in World War I, which is really not that many. I shouldn't even say see the field. They were produced and delivered. In terms of actually getting in the field, very limited numbers. Some of it, too, was just they thought, and I say they, the Allies and specifically the United States thought so highly of this gun, they didn't want them to fall in the German hands to be reverse engineered and maybe tip the balance of war. So they held them back intentionally over that. And there was a lot of reverse engineering of each other's firearms to advance weaponry forward in World War I. So it's not an unrealistic worry. It's just interesting that that's what they were prioritizing. So these had limited impact. Depends on who you read. Some people say they had great impact. I would make the argument they had very limited impact because there's only one or two known instances where they were used. And World War I ended mostly because the Germans went broke over the course of the war. And of course, the Treaty of Versailles signed and the armistice, which ultimately led to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany, which of course would make the Third Reich, and then the Japanese would get angry over the Treaty of Versailles too because they fought on the behalf of the Allies in World War I and were cut out completely of the armistice, and then Germany felt put upon, and those two would join forces and World War II would kick off formally in 1940, 1941. And that's where we kind of fast forward to see this version of the gun. So this gun would be reworked in the 1930s. A fire regulator would be attached to it to regulate the fire from fast to slow. This was done to preserve ammo, and because with a 20-round magazine, you are limited in what you could do with it. And that's kind of where the drawback of this gun, especially in Europe, is really seen. This gun is very heavy. I know this is a semi-auto version. This is still kind of done to spec. It's an extremely heavy gun, and we don't even have the bipod on it. I have that over in the corner there. So you're already in the position of having an extremely heavy firearm. Now, certainly with 30-06, this helps with controllability, and with your fire modulator, that also helps with controllability. it's still very uncomfortable and very unwieldy. So the person in the field using this, doing the hip fire and trying to move quickly, is at a bit of a disadvantage. You also got to realize that Americans at this time are much shorter, like 5'8" to 150 to 180 pounds roughly. That was your average American compared to today. So they're lugging around a 20+ pound gun plus all their gear. It's pretty impressive, actually, when you think about it. And hats off to that generation that did do this and save the free world. So in Europe, this was used kind of in the light machine gun role, which it didn't do particularly well, because that's not really what it was designed to do. And with your 20-round magazine, it's very hard to fulfill a light machine gun role. That's why the bipod would a lot of times get thrown away by the grunts in the front on the front lines. The idea was, with your bipod, you would prop it up and you would use it to suppress your enemy in the field with a highly maneuverable, that's typically what you're talking about with a light machine gun, a highly movable machine gun, easily deployable. That is not really what this satisfies. With its limited capacity, as well with its just sheer weight, it doesn't really satisfy that. For the walking, strafing approach, the Marine Corps would use that to some success against the Japanese, especially fixed positions. So we shouldn't discount that. That is what this weapon was designed for. It does have a rear aperture sight that would allow for marksmanship shots, and that was something that you could do by selecting it safe, semi-full, and then you would have your fire moderator. But again, it's not really a marksmanship rifle either. Doesn't do that particularly well. And that's obviously not what we would deploy it as we had Springfield 1903s, for instance, the A4 variant, which is the quote-unquote sniper version, if you will. That was used as our marksmanship rifle. So in a lot of ways, this gun really didn't do anything particularly well. Some of that's the tactics that were being used, trying to implement this in a light machine gun role, which it really is not. Some of it is just the nature of warfare and how it changed. You're not charging trenches, you're charging, say, pillboxes, or in the case of the Pacific, hidden enemies. Now 30-06 certainly allowed you to cut through the jungle, if you will, and say Tarawa and places like that. But this gun was really designed with World War I in mind, and we're kind of retrofitting it to fit in World War II. Which is why, come Vietnam, despite the fact that these things were produced all the way through the 1960s for the military, this really had gone the way of the dodo. You would see Thompsons and stuff make appearance in Vietnam. There were some of these that did, but very infrequently and almost non-existent. Even by Korea, you're starting to see these things disappear from military stores. And that's really where this particular gun comes into play, is the World War II Korea era. It's an A2 clone, if you will. This is produced by Ohio Ordnance, meaning it's a closed bolt select fire. Sorry, semi-auto, not select fire. It's a non-select fire is what I meant to say, variant of this gun, but it is made to spec and it is something that you on the civilian market can buy. There are transferables of these, and I do wish I had one of those here for you to show off. They're extremely expensive. This is probably a good plug for our Patreon. If you'd like for us to bring a transferable BAR to the table, or even maybe a post sample, we need a lot of Patreon subscribers. So just keep clicking that subscribe button on YouTube, and keep subscribing on Patreon, and maybe eventually we can bring you a select fire version of one of these. It would be very cool to see and have. But of course, this is a good representation of what they represent. Now, this would continue to be developed and ultimately result in the H-car, which I do have, but I don't have out to show for you, which is a real tragedy. But the H-car is the modernized, if you want to call it, battle rifle. It's not a battle rifle, it's not select fire, it's a semi-auto, and but it is the modern sporting rifle version of the BAR. It is the same internal mechanism. It is 30-06. It takes a detachable magazine, except that's been extended out to 25 rounds 30 rounds instead of 20, to come into play with more standard capacity rounds. And it does feature the rail system, the modularity of a modern sporting rifle, circa the AR-15, so on and so forth. So this has been modernized and updated, and that is certainly an excellent weapon system. And I would highly encourage you to go get one if you can afford so. That is the downside to the H-car. They're extremely expensive. These are extremely expensive. Even the semi-auto variants are extremely expensive, unfortunately, which does kind of put these out of reach for most people. We're fortunate enough to have this variant here, and we're very happy to show it to you. John Moses Browning is just truly amazing. Designing something like this in 1910, despite the fact there's no cry for it at the time, just forward thinking to what would be coming here in the future. And unfortunately, he would pass away in 1921, so he wouldn't see the full implementation of this weapon system, though he did see his son use it in World War I. And the fact that we still find the fascination with his gun designs kind of speaks to the longevity of what he was doing. And some of the mechanisms, as a piston-driven system, would be used later in modern machine guns. So in some ways, the legacy of this is still continuing, just in other guns, where they're taking operating systems, for instance, that was implemented in this and using it in modern guns. The Shoshaw was antiquated, by the time World War I kicked off, if we're just being honest. And that's just a fact that gun manufacturing was advancing so quickly in the early 1900s. But that was all a lot of people had. And so you're using these machine guns that weren't designed with World War I in mind, and trying to make them fit to the war, where this was kind of the first, or some of the first guns. I won't say it's the only one, because there were several. He had several models, like the Browning 1919 and so on and so forth, the M2s and all that would go on the serve, and still serve in some instances to this day. But this gun was one of the first ones really designed with that war and that type of warfare in mind. So it's very cool to bring that to you guys. Again, I do hope you like, comment, and subscribe. We got much more for you. We got another very cool weapon system up next, and can't wait to show that to you. But until next time.